to start doing stuff. So instead of just deleting code, we'll actually make some code. The thing we're going to do is we're just going to learn the basics about UITableViews. So just the table view widget itself and kind of how that works. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a new file. It's called a temp ViewController. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come into my project again here. I'm going to right click on this top group. I'm going to say new file. And we are going to go iOS source, and we could make a CocoaTouch class or we could make a Swift file. The difference is if you say CocoaTouch class, it'll fill in like some methods that you might want depending on what type of file it is. So I want that, so I'm going to say CocoaTouch class, and I'm going to say that it's a subclass of a UI view controller. Once you do that, you can see it recommends a name for you, a view controller. I'm going to call it a temp view controller. I want my language to be Swift, just because we're doing things in Swift land. And you can probably guess by the name that this is going to be something we're going to work with for a little while, but not a long time. You can save it wherever you want. Once it opens up, we can clean it up a little bit. Did receive memory warning, we're not worried about that. Navigation, we will worry about that later in this app, but not right now. View did load, sure, I'll keep that around, but I don't really need this comment, right? And to be honest, you don't have to have view did load. It's just that I use it so much that I typically just kind of leave it there because I often do use it. All right, so we've got a new view controller stripped down to its bones. Let's go over to our storyboard and start adding things back. So what I want to do here is I want to do a search for view controller. It turns out it's the top item, so I don't have to search far. And I just want to drag it and drop it over. Now for this app, the only thing I'm actually worried about is iPhone portrait. I could do any because it would be fairly easy, but I think my slides have it set up for only iPhone portrait, so I'm going to do that as well. Also, if I'm focused on iPhone portrait, you can in the project uncheck landscape left, landscape right. I don't really care if you do that or not, but that way it could force your users to only use landscape portrait. And to be honest, if I'm using landscape portrait, I could also just go ahead and make things directly into that storyboard. The only real difference between the two is it kind of looks like an iPhone this way, whereas you say any, it's just a generic box, right? So it doesn't matter what you do, but I'm going to say compact regular, just so it kind of looks like an iPhone, right? All right, so what I've got here is I've got a view controller. Right now, if you click on it and you go to the identity inspector, the third column over, you'll see that it doesn't have a custom class yet. I want to say that this is a temp view controller, and if you watch up here, that should change as soon as I click on that, right? And sure enough, it did. So this is now a temp view controller. The other thing we're going to have to do is you'll notice that there's no arrow next to it, and that's because it's not set as the initial view controller, but that's easy to fix. In the attributes panel, the fourth one over, just say is initial view controller, and you can see that it adds an arrow for you real quick. We're also going to be putting stuff on here, and I'd like to kind of see it better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the view, and I'm going to make it yellow. Sounds like a great color. So now we've got a yellow view and a temp view controller. And what we really want to learn about is tables. You can see that right here on this list, there's a table view controller. We'll worry about those later. Right now, we're not worried about a table view controller. We're just worried about a table view, which you can see is different. So a table view, I mean, it's kind of like a button in that it's just a view with a special purpose, right? So this is a table view. You can read all about it. We're just going to drop it onto our storyboard here. Has to be at 100% to drop things. And we could, just go through and set all the constraints on this guy, just like we've done so many times with our storyboards. Now it turns out that this is so temporary in nature. I'm just going to kind of drop it on here about there, right? So I didn't go to the full width. I didn't go to the full height. I just kind of plunked a table view in here. So what we want to start doing is we want to start putting data into this table. And the question is, how do you do that, right? How do I get data to show up in this table? There are two types of tables. If you go over to its attributes inspector, there are ones with dynamic properties. This is much more common. And there's also one with static cells, which is very uncommon. Static cells we actually did on the first day. That's just, you just hard code like 3 rows in. And to be honest, at that point, they're just kind of like buttons. So dynamic properties is how you almost always do these things. And the way it works is through a process called delegation. So you have to assign somebody to be your delegate, right? And then whoever your delegate is, that's the person you ask questions of when you need information. It's also the person that you tell things to when something happens. Like if somebody presses, you can tell your delegate. With table views, they broke it up into two separate delegates. One of them is called delegate, and the other is called data source. Data source is how you get information. Lots of talking. Let's start doing. So we need to connect our table view to our view controller. One way to do that is graphically. So you can right-click, drag. Looks like I held it for too long. So if I just right-click, drag from here to there, I can connect the data source. There's a ton of ways to make these connections. Another way I could have done it is if I click on the table view, I could go to his connections inspector, and I could drag from this circle over to this guy, right? So there's a ton of ways to do these things. Regardless of how you did it, make sure you select the view controller and look at his connections, and make sure he's set up to be the data source and the delegate of this table view. So it's for historical reasons that there are two delegates. It's because one is like for getting the data, and the other is for like telling things that happen, right? It's kind of the basic way to do it. It turns out that every app I've ever made, I've connected them both to the view controller, so it's kind of worthless. All right, so that's who I'm going to ask information of. There's a little bit more we have to do in the storyboard, so I'm going to do that here. We also have to have what's called a cell prototype. There's a couple ways to do it, but a cell prototype is the easiest way. And so a cell prototype is a table view cell, a row, right? So what I want you to do is I want you to drag, so left mouse click drag, right? Drag a table view cell and drop it onto your table. And you can see that it makes an area called prototype cells, and it puts in your first cell prototype. Your first cell prototype has attributes. You can go to the attributes inspector. The first attribute is what type it is. So it could be basic, which is a single string. It could be right detail, which you've probably seen this a lot in Apple's own UIs. Left detail, which I don't really like as well. Or it could be subtitle. Eventually in this app, we're going to use subtitle, but for now, we're going to go with basic. So that's one thing that the cell needs. It also needs what's called a reuse identifier. So this is the name that you're going to use when you refer to it in code. I'm going to call this temp cell. To be honest, whenever I type an identifier in my storyboard, I typically copy it, like right then and right there, and go over into my code, and I make a constant out of it. So here I'll just call it like temp cell identifier, and I'm going to want it to be lowercase t in the front because it's a variable. I guess it's a constant. And I'm just going to set that equal to temp cell. And I just do that out of practice. Whenever I have a string that has to match a string from the storyboard, very common with different identifiers, I just go ahead and do that just as soon as I type it, and then I don't forget later. All right, so we've made this prototype. We've made this temp cell. It actually turns out we're done with the storyboard. So we've got our view on here. We certainly could have added constraints for the table view, but I'm not that worried about it. If you run it right now, it's going to get very upset with you, right? And it's going to crash, and that's because it's trying to get things like number of rows in section from the delegate, right? Because you said you were my delegate, and that means I'm going to ask you questions, but you haven't implemented them yet. So we're going to start fixing the code side. So let's go into the code, so the temp view controller. In order to be a delegate, what you need to do is you need to implement certain protocols. In this case, the names of the protocols are UITableView delegate and data source. So I'm going to say delegate first, and then data source second. And code completion makes your life a lot easier, right? So I'm going to implement those two protocols, and you can see claiming to implement them is great, but we don't conform to them yet. So it's yelling at us. Thank you for that. These two protocols are really fun. There's a lot of methods in there. The methods in a protocol can be required or optional. It turns out that these two total have only two required methods. And you can start figuring out what they are because they all start with the word table view, which is really kind of handy in trying to figure these things. So they all start with table view, and so you can just kind of type the word table view, and you can scroll through here. The one that we're looking for is number of rows in section. This one is required. So once I find it, I'm just going to hit enter, and it kind of stubs in the basics there. And you can see how important these external parameter names are, because like all of those functions, like if you thought of the function name as just being the first part, all of those functions will be called table view, right? And you can't have, 30 functions all called table view. And so that's why the external parameter name is so important. And so we learned from Objective-C that, that external parameter name is around because that's how Objective-C worked, right? It considered that to be part of the function name. So this method, as you can see, it ultimately returns an int. And you can guess by the name number of rows, right? So this is how many rows are there. For this test, I'm just going to hard code it. I'm just going to say there are 5 rows. Yeah. Let's go look for some more methods. So start typing table view. The other one that's required is cell for row at index path. So there it is, cell for row at index path. And the way cell for row at index path works is it ultimately has to return a UITableView cell. And so this is like what's going to be in the table. So what I want to do is I want to say let cell equal, and we want to create the table view cell. What we really want to do is we want to be efficient, and we want to do a thing called DQ reusable cell with identifier for index path. So we want this method that I'm on right there. You'll notice that what this returns is an any object, which is kind of a pain. It'd be nice if it just returned a table view cell, but it returns an any object. I'm sure there's a good reason for that. I just don't know what it is. And you have to pass an identifier. Well, we've already made a constant for our identifier up here, so that's nice. So we just want temp cell identifier for index path. Index path sounds intimidating, but it's actually a really simple thing. It's just, it's basically a struct that has both a row and a section. If you think about like the Contacts app in an Apple iPhone, it has like the A section, the B section, the C section. So those are the sections, and then the row is in the section. So really, it looks intimidating to say index path, but it's a simple thing. And we have it passed into this function, and we just pass it through to the next function. And at the bottom, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to return the cell. It's yelling at us now because right now cell is an any object, and we just want to cast it to be a UITableView cell, and then our error will go away. So this is kind of the way you typically start this function and the way you typically end it. And then in the middle, what your job is to configure this cell, right? So that's your job. So what we're going to do is we're going to type cell dot, and we want to reference that basic cell that we had. It turns out that there's a single label on there, and the name of that label is text label. So I just start typing text label, and then I hit enter. And then on the text label, I want the dot text. So I start typing the word text, and then I hit enter. When Swift first launched, text label was required. Now it's an optional, so you may or may not need this question mark depending on which version you're running. Probably you'll need it just like I did. But the nice thing is I didn't type it. I just typed TEX and then hit enter, and it auto-completed. And so what I want to do is I just want to put a simple message. So I'll just say, this is row, and I'll just print out the row number. So I'll say indexPath.row, and that's what we'll put on each one. So this shows the bare bones basics of what it takes to use a table view. I guess I did not end up using ViewDidLoad, so I actually could delete that one if I wanted. And I really just need these two methods as my required methods when I want to use a table. So let's go ahead and run it and make sure it works. I've kind of been talking a big game. And sure enough, there it is. It works, and it prints out, this is row 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see that you can kind of bounce it around. You get that for free on the top and the bottom. If you wanted to change the number of rows, if you just made it 50 instead of 5, that should work out fine. And now all of a sudden you've got 50 rows, so 0 through 49. And there's all kinds of little things we could add, but we'll save those until next time. I just wanted to give you this concept of what a table view is, and it's just a view How it gets its data is through delegation, through a delegate and data source. And there's a certain number of minimum questions you have to answer to get it to show up. All right, so that is the basics of a table view. You may have noticed that I called it temp, and I called it that for a reason. As soon as you've got it working, what I want you to do is I want you to visit your storyboard and delete the scene that we've got in here. And then what I want you to do is I want you to right-click on this file and say delete, right? So it was called temp ViewController for a reason because now it's gone. So this whole video, we made something. The goal was for you to learn, but we're actually taking it back to a blank slate. And next time, we'll start in with some more permanent things. So hopefully you're a little bit smarter because next time we're going to start making this real happen. See you then.